Good afternoon. My name is Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute here at WSU. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this year's Thomas S. Foley Distinguished Lecture, which will be given by Nick Hanauer. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to recognize some of our partners and others who have helped make this event possible. These include the WSU College of Arts and Sciences, the WSU Student Entertainment Board, the Spokesman Review, the Inlander Magazine, as well as Ron and Debbie Reed, David Mercury Advertising, and the Clark Company. Finally, I want to give a special thanks to President Elson Floyd and to Vice Provost Erica Austin, who's in the audience here, for helping us entertain our guest while he's on campus today. The Foley Institute was established at WSU in 1995 to honor the service of Thomas S. Foley, including 30 years representing the citizens in the 5th Congressional District, as well as his service as Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives and as the Ambassador to Japan. Unfortunately, as many of you know, our beloved Mr. Foley passed away last year. He was honored in memorial services both in Spokane and in Washington, D.C. at the nation's Capitol building, where he was, President Obama and President Clinton and many other dignitaries paid tribute to him. Mr. Foley's widow, however, Heather Foley, is in the audience today, and I want to just take a moment to recognize her. Heather? The institute that bears Mr. Foley's name continues his legacy of statesmanship, integrity, and commitment to public service through a variety of different programs that educate the public about democracy and public affairs and encourages young people to pursue careers in public service. We do a lot of exciting things at the Institute, and if you'd like to know more about us, I encourage you to go to our website, to like us on Facebook, or send us an email, and you will receive information about our future programs and events. The Foley Distinguished Lecture Series recognizes Mr. Foley's belief that the critical challenges we face in the 21st century can only be met through innovative thinking and informed and civil dialogue. Some of our previous distinguished lecturers have included such luminaries as former Vermont Governor Howard Dean, New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof, former U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft, political scholar Morris Fiorina, and accomplished writers and social commentators like Christopher Hitchens and Chris Hedges. Tonight's speaker, Nick Hanauer, is a highly successful business leader, an author, and a civic activist. Born in New York, Nick moved to the Seattle area at a young age, where his family began and still owns Pacific Coast Feather Company. After obtaining a degree in philosophy, Nick began an enormously successful career as a business entrepreneur. He was an early investor in Amazon.com, and he later founded Quantive, which was acquired by Microsoft for $6 billion, and as well as Gear.com, which eventually merged with Overstock.com. In 2000, he founded Second Avenue Partners, a major venture capital company in Seattle. Along with Eric Liu, Nick has co-authored 2 national bestsellers: The True Patriot, which was published in 2007, in which they argue patriotism requires us to put national interest above self-interest, contribution above consumption, and stewardship over exploitation. More recently, in Gardens of Democracy, published in 2011, they offer us an optimistic and timely summons to rethink our role as citizens in a democratic society. Nick is the co-founder of the True Patriot Network, a nonpartisan think tank, as well as co-founder of the League of Education Voters, a nonpartisan political organization dedicated to public education. He currently serves as the director of the Democracy Alliance, and he serves as a board member on a variety of civic organizations, including the Cascade Land Conservancy, the Seattle Alliance for Education, and the MT Lemon Science Center. In addition, he and his wife, Leslie, co-manage the Nick and Leslie Hanauer Foundation, which works to improve education, the environment, and supports a variety of other causes. The subject of Nick's talk today could not be more timely or more important. This month, the Census Bureau announced that 46 million Americans, 15% of the American population, live below the poverty level. This includes a stunning 1 in 4 of all American children. Meanwhile, the stock market, CEO compensation, and corporate profits are all at record highs. The top 1% now take in over 20% of all incomes earned in the country. They own 40% of U.S. financial wealth, more than 3 times as much as the bottom 80% of Americans combined. Nick has been one of the most vocal and thoughtful critics of the policies that has led to this staggering level of economic inequality. His message focuses not only on the moral imperatives involved, but also on the economic disaster that awaits if no action is taken to confront this problem. His experience as a highly successful business leader gives him a unique perspective, and his ideas have been featured in numerous articles, opinion pieces, television news programs, TED Talks, and he recently appeared prominently in Robert Reich's documentary, Inequality for All. Nick is going to speak for about 30 minutes, after which there'll be some time for questions from the audience. So without any further ado, I give you Nick Hanauer.
Oh, good morning. I must say thank you all for coming. I am stunned to see so many people. Please tell me you were either paid or get credit for being here. So I'll tell you what, when I was in college, I wouldn't have come. I'd have been outside in the sun. I want to thank the Foley Institute for having me here. It's really fun. I must admit, I have not been to Pullman since I was in college. But it's a beautiful place, and it's like a lot of fun, and I got to have a fun lunch and meet Heather Foley and other luminaries from your university, and it was a neat thing to get to do. I'll tell you what, though, I reckon if Tom Foley was still Speaker of the House, this country would be in better shape than it is. That's for sure. A couple of things. The first is that the ideas that I'm going to express in this talk are not just mine, but are the consequence of a collaboration between me and mostly a guy named Eric Beinhocker, who is a global luminary in the world of sort of new ways of thinking about economics. He runs something called the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford University, very important center. And behind him is a constellation of some of the smartest people on planet Earth at the Santa Fe Institute and other places. And I just want to be sure that at least if you don't like the ideas that I'm going to share, you blame them equally with me. If you do, then you can forget I said anything and just give it all the credit to me. But there is a multitude of people who have contributed to this set of ideas I'm going to share with you today. I wanted to write, and I know you wanted to hear, a speech filled with funny, ribald stories and dirty jokes and so on and so forth. I regret that that's not what we're going to have today. It's sort of a wonky talk, so you're going to have to stick with me. In any case, I want to start by saying that I believe that the principal lesson of the 20th century was that capitalism works and communism and socialism do not. There is simply no question in my mind that market capitalism has yielded massive increases in human prosperity, particularly in the West, but also while lifting hundreds of millions from poverty around the world. Yet despite these historic accomplishments, it is obvious that something is very wrong with how the system is performing today. The financial crisis of 2008, the stagnation of the middle class, rising economic inequality, global warming, these are all challenging our most deeply held beliefs about how a fair and well-functioning society should be organized. Even Wall Street is beginning to take notice. In the last few weeks, both Standard & Poor's and Morgan Stanley have issued reports warning investors that rising inequality is holding back economic growth. And this year, in his groundbreaking book, Capital in the 21st Century, French economist Thomas Piketty makes an extraordinarily convincing argument that left unmanaged, slow growth and rising inequality are inherent norms for capitalist economies. But no free and open society can sustain endlessly rising inequality for long. There is no example in human history. You show me a highly unequal society, and eventually I will show you either a police state or a revolution. There are no counterexamples. So the question is, has capitalism finally run its course? Will Karl Marx ultimately be proven right that capitalism produces, above all and in the end, are its own gravediggers? I don't believe this is inevitable. In fact, I believe that when well managed, capitalism is the greatest social technology ever invented to both create and distribute prosperity in human societies. Where we have gone wrong is in misidentifying how and why capitalism works. And it is this fundamental misunderstanding that has fostered the policies that have led directly to our current crisis of economic inequality, and to the broader dissatisfaction people have with the economy in our country and around the world. Our economic challenge isn't fundamentally inequality per se. Our challenge is to explain what prosperity is and where growth comes from. For the economic inequality that we experience today is a symptom, not the disease, a consequence of the explanations we have been using to answer these questions. The challenge for the 21st century and the purpose of my talk today is to show that the existing explanation we have for what prosperity is and where growth comes from is wrong, and to point to a way to better and more effectively explain in a common sense way where these things come from. An emerging new paradigm based on empirical research rather than a century-old theory understands that capitalism's true genius is expressed not in efficiently allocating existing resources, but in effectively creating new solutions to human problems. And this new paradigm recognizes that broad-based economic inclusion isn't a moral imperative if and when we have growth. It is the principal mechanism that creates growth in capitalist economies. We do not need a new economic system. What we need is a better understanding of how and why capitalism works. By analogy, our ancestors knew that the stars and planets moved in the sky. But it wasn't until Copernicus showed that the sun and not the earth was at the center of the solar system that we finally had a valid explanation for how and why they move. Likewise, now, after 40 years of stagnant wages and rising inequality, it is time to replace our old economic theories with better and more modern ones. For it is only through a deeper 21st century understanding of our capitalist system that we can hope to improve it. To save capitalism, we must redefine it. And to redefine capitalism, we must first understand where the old definitions went wrong. For the past century, the dominant economic paradigm has painted a narrow and mechanistic view of how capitalism works, focusing on the role of markets and prices in the efficient allocation of resources. The story is familiar. Rational, self-interested firms maximize profits. Rational, self-interested consumers maximize their utility. The decisions of these rational actors drive supply to equal demand. Prices are set, the market clears, and resources are allocated in a socially optimal way. From this theory, we've derived the trickle-down policy framework that now dominates thinking on both the left and the right. Markets are perfectly efficient, and anything that interferes with the so-called free market interferes with this efficiency and is bad. The rich are job creators. The more money and profits they have, the more jobs they create. Anything that impedes this, either through taxation or regulation, is by definition stupid and bad. In this view, rising inequality, crucially, is a feature of prosperity. It's how we know things are getting better. If the rich get richer, that's good for the economy. If the poor get richer, that's bad for the economy. You know the drill. It's a beautiful theory, a mechanized view befitting the mechanized industrial era from which it sprang. It is almost Newtonian in its elegant simplicity, and its practitioners and believers would like us all to think that the theory's principles, like when wages go up, employment goes down, have the force and validity of physical laws of nature. But over the past several decades, most of the bedrock assumptions of neoclassical economics have begun to unravel. Behavioral economists have accumulated a mountain of evidence to showing that real human beings don't actually behave all that rationally. Empirical economists have identified anomalies suggesting that financial markets aren't efficient at all. Experimental economists have raised problematic questions about the very existence of utility, the device economists have long relied on to prove that markets maximize social welfare. These observations lead thoughtful observers to the conclusion that markets are not characterized by immutable physical laws like force equals mass times acceleration, but rather they're constructed of social and moral laws like bedtime is 9 p.m. So humans aren't rational, markets aren't inherently efficient, and there may actually be no such thing as utility. No wonder the macroeconomic models built on these neoclassical ideas crashed and burned during the crisis of 2008. Conventional theory holds that the economy views the economy as a sort of rocking horse that, when perturbed by an outside force, sways for a while before predictably settling back to equilibrium. But as Andy Haldane, the chief economist of the Bank of England, has pointed out, what we saw in 2008 was more like a stampede of wild horses. Something spooks one of them, it kicks another horse, and pretty soon the whole herd is running wildly in a pattern of complex, dynamic behavior. The rocking horse paradigm of neoclassical economics didn't hold up. Market economies aren't simply mechanistic and predictable in the way that that theory describes. But over the last 30 years or so, a revolution has taken place in our understanding, in our scientific and mathematical understanding of the systemic nature of the world we inhabit. We went from thinking of human social systems as linear equilibrium systems to what we now call nonlinear, non-equilibrium, complex systems. This new view holds that the economy is a constantly evolving, interacting network of highly diverse households, firms, banks, regulators, and other agents, much more like Haldane's wild herd than the conventional neoclassical rocking horse. Complex, dynamic, open, nonlinear, a capitalist economy has more in common with an ecosystem than with the mechanistic systems on which the neoclassicists modeled their theory. And this view suggests that, like an ecosystem, markets are evolutionary systems that each day carry out millions of simultaneous experiments on how to make our lives better. The implications of this emerging view are just only beginning to be explored, but I believe it has fundamental implications for how people think about the nature of capitalism and prosperity. Significantly, this view identifies the essential role of capitalism not as allocation, but as invention, as creation. Think about it. Life isn't drastically better today than it was in 1800 because we are allocating 19th century economic resources more efficiently. Rather, it is better because we have created life-saving antibiotics, indoor plumbing, motorized transport, et cetera, and all of which have become available to much, if not all, of the world's population. The genius of capitalism is that it creates incentives both for solving human problems and for making those solutions widely available. And it is the accumulation of solutions to human problems that ultimately defines prosperity, not the accumulation of money. Most of us intuitively believe that the more money people have, the more prosperous society must be. But the idea that prosperity is money is simply about having money can be easily disproved with a simple thought experiment. Imagine you were king or queen of the jungle with a pile of money in the form of beads as high as a house. But all that money wouldn't buy you antibiotics or air conditioning or a comfy bed. Yet even the poorest Americans have access to these crucial elements of well-being. Or if you prefer a thought experiment closer to home, who do you think would be healthier, happier, and live a longer life? An average 21st century American or the wealthiest of our 18th century founding fathers? On an inflation-adjusted basis, these were wealthy folks, but there is simply no doubt that their lives were shorter, sicker, dirtier, colder or hotter, and lousier. Prosperity and money simply are not the same thing. Money is simply a medium of exchange and a store of value. Properly understood, the prosperity of a society should be measured by the accumulation of solutions to human problems, not the accumulation of monetary wealth. These solutions can run from the prosaic, like a crunchier potato chip, to the profound, like a cure for a deadly disease, every item in a modern retail store can be thought of as a solution to a different kind of problem: how to eat, dress, entertain, decorate our homes, etc. The more and better the solutions available to us, the more prosperity we have. And the more broadly a society makes those solutions available to its people, the more prosperous that society is. So if prosperity is measured by our ability to solve human problems, how do we measure economic growth? We typically talk about growth in terms of money, gross domestic product, or GDP, essentially the sum of the monetary value of economic activity. There have been a variety of attempts to make GDP account for things such as environmental damage, unpaid work, the progress of technology, or the development of human capital, but at the core, GDP is a monetary measure of output. In my view, the bigger problem with GDP is not that it doesn't accurately measure economic growth, but that it doesn't necessarily reflect how growth changes the real lived experience of the typical family. In the United States, for example, GDP has more than tripled over the last 3 decades. I didn't bring slides, but if I had, I could show you a chart of GDP that looks like this. It is a very happy picture. But is the lived experience of the typical family improving in the same way? Would a chart of their experience reflect GDP? And the answer is absolutely not. Most people have experienced the last several decades like this or like this. And that is because 3 decades ago, the median wage decoupled from GDP and productivity gains. The difference between these two realities, the difference between GDP versus lived experience, is the difference between output and outcomes. If the concept of growth is to have significance and relevance in people's lives, it should represent outcomes, real improvement in people's lives. If the real measure of a society's prosperity is the availability of solutions to human problems, growth cannot simply be measured by changes in GDP. Rather, it must be a measure of the rate at which new solutions to human problems are created. Going from fearing death from a sinus infection one day to having access to life-saving antibiotics the next, that is growth. Going from sweltering in the heat on one day to living with air conditioning the next, that is growth. Going from needing to look up basic information in a library to having all of the world's information available to you instantaneously on your phone, that is growth. Growth is best thought of as an increase in both the quality and distribution of solutions to human problems. For example, take the smartphone. It is a problem-solving machine. When you download a new app, what you are actually loading onto your phone is a new solution. The reason we cannot seem to live without these things anymore is that they are literally the most powerful problem-solving tool in the history of humanity. Problems, of course, differ in importance, and a new view of growth must take this into account. For example, finding a cure to cancer is better and more important than other product innovations, but only if this cure is available to many people. In general, economic growth is the actual experience of having our lives improved. One implication of this view is that an economy that concentrates wealth at the top will only provide incentives for capitalists to solve the problems of the rich. And we are rapidly becoming an economy that bifurcates in this way. Many of the big retail companies and others that used to serve the middle class are in sharp decline. Can the rate at which solutions appear and are made available be measured? While such a measure has not been tried, I believe it is possible. Inflation is measured by looking at changes in the prices in goods and services in a basket, typically consumed by households. Similarly, it's possible to look at how the actual contents of such a basket are changing across time and how they differ across countries or levels of income. Outcomes are usually harder to measure than output, but by redefining economic growth from a measure of monetary value to a measure of available solutions, we inevitably redefine capitalism itself. If prosperity is created solving human problems, the central question for a society then is what kind of economic system will solve the most problems for the most people the most quickly? And this is the genius of capitalism. It is an unmatched evolutionary system for finding solutions to human problems. The genius of capitalism is that it rewards people for solving other people's problems. The orthodox view, on the other hand, is that capitalism creates value by efficiently allocating existing resources. This is simply not true. The essential role of capitalism is not allocation, it's creation. The orthodox view is that market economies are efficient. They are not. On the contrary, just like all evolutionary systems, like in nature, they are extraordinarily wasteful. 80% of all companies fail within 18 months of founding. Waste in market economies is everywhere. Capitalism works by effectively creating new solutions to human problems. Capitalist economies are effective if well managed. The implications of that difference, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, are profound and can lead us to a new and much better explanation for how capitalist economies create growth and thus what policies are optimal. Because an economy is a type of ecosystem, markets are evolutionary systems that each day carry out millions of simultaneous experiments on how to make our lives better. The economy evolves like a natural ecosystem, and companies are the evolving organisms within it. At this very moment, around the world, millions of teams of people are working hard to provide us with better medicines, more attractive clothes, tastier food, a smartphone with better features, and other things that make our material standard of living better. You can think of these millions of competing solutions as equivalent to genetic diversity. And just like in a natural ecosystem, the most adaptive solutions ultimately prevail. As I said before, life isn't drastically better for billions of people today than it was in 1800 because we are allocating the resources of the 19th century economy more efficiently. If so, we'd all be drowning in buggy whips. Rather, it is because we have life-saving antibiotics, indoor plumbing, motorized transport, etc. The genius of capitalism is that it both creates incentives for solving human problems and for making those solutions widely available. Not only does capitalism create incentives for people to pour their creative energies into solving other people's problems, it does so in a way that facilitates trade, specialization, and cooperation on a massive scale. When you buy a car, you're at the end of an incredibly complex supply chain involving specialized knowledge and abilities that stretches across dozens of countries, hundreds of companies, thousands or millions of people, few of whom have ever met each other, yet all of whom work together in a complex web of cooperation that enables you to drive off the lot. The foundation of prosperity in human societies is cooperation leading to trade. Market capitalism creates trade, and trade in turn creates specialization. Trade allows people to specialize, and specialization, breaking problems up into finer and finer subproblems, is truly the source of all new knowledge. The more trade we have, the more specialization we have, the more new knowledge societies create. Societies where people are self-sufficient, by the way, are always poor. That's because there is a very clear upward boundary to what one person can know. No one can ever know how to build this phone. It takes the specialized, disaggregated knowledge of thousands of people to build this phone. And technology, the foundation of all new solutions to human problems, is a consequence of using and rearranging specialized knowledge in novel ways. Technology, innovation, invention is taking specialized knowledge and mixing it together in new ways to create a new solution to a human problem. But all of the dynamics that enable this evolutionary and algorithmic process depend on and scale with participation, on inclusion. This is obvious when you think about it. The more people trade, the more people who can specialize. The more people who can harness this specialization to become entrepreneurs and inventors, the more problems we solve. The more customers those entrepreneurs have, the faster the virtuous cycle goes and the more prosperity we create. And naturally, the more diverse the participants and their approaches to problem solving, the more dynamic and robust the system and the more quickly difficult problems are surmounted. Seen in this way, growth is the consequence of a feedback loop between the increasing numbers of innovators who create new solutions to human problems and the consumers who create increasing demand that supports and sustains that innovation. This makes clear that the central driver or mechanism of growth is inclusion, the degree to which we maximize the number of robust participants in this feedback loop. And if this is true, then the explicit goal of our economic policies must be to maximize the number of diverse and able innovators and customers in our economy. This is the most fundamental point I want to make today, and the one that defines the essence of a 21st century theory of growth. The orthodox view, on the other hand, is that if we have growth, we should try to include people in it for moral reasons. What I am claiming is that this view is wrong and backwards. I am claiming that moral issues aside, inclusion is the fundamental mechanism that creates growth in capitalist economies. Orthodox trickle-down theory holds that a thriving middle class is the consequence of growth. If we make rich people richer and less constrained by regulation, that prosperity will trickle down to the middle class and the poor. This is wrong. A thriving middle class is the source of prosperity in capitalist economies. Prosperity does not trickle down from the top. It is always built from the middle out. And this is what we mean when we say, by the way, middle out economics, and why policies focused on middle class that maximize the number of people included in the economy in every way, that harness the full potential of every citizen, whether they be seller or buyer or both, are the only policies that ever lead to true growth. But maximizing participation, not just at the top, but from the middle out, it requires effort and investment. It does not happen magically by itself, which is why every prosperous capitalist economy on Earth is characterized by both high rates of investment in its middle class and the infrastructure they depend on, and equally, the progressive taxation and labor standards necessary to fund those investments. And this is why, moral issues aside, inequality is so toxic to growth. High levels of inequality exclude people as innovators and as customers, diminishing both innovation and demand. But a more reasonable distribution of income, along with a tax system adequate to make key investments in education and R&D and transportation and so forth, both includes and enfranchises people. This is why policies like raising the minimum wage, for instance, increase growth. They help include more people in the economy. The central argument of trickle-down economics is that it is the wealth of the wealthy and the profits of corporations, the accumulated concentration of capital, that is the source of growth. 200 years ago, this was also untrue, but at least it was plausible. Today, in the 21st century, it is innovation and inclusion that are the primary sources of growth and the most meaningful measure of prosperity. Trickle-down theory inherently argues that all taxes on profits and wealth necessarily kill growth. Our 21st century theory recognizes that profits and wealth are merely the byproduct of growth, and that taxes sufficient to invest in inclusionary programs like education and transportation are absolutely necessary to create the economic growth from which we all prosper. For the past 40 years, trickle-down orthodoxy has shaped and guided our nation's economic policies, and these policies have failed because these old theories fail to describe the real economy. They describe an imaginary economy. The real economy grows from the middle out, not the top down. The contrast between our contemporary theory of growth and the old failed theory are clear. It is a contrast between creation versus allocation, effectiveness versus efficiency, outcomes versus output, and inclusion versus exclusion. It is a contrast between an increasing returns world of sellers and buyers versus the old zero-sum world of makers and takers. There are many policy implications of this new theory of growth, and I don't have the time to explore them now. But I am the guest today of a public university, so I will share just one. If the trickle-down growth of theory is correct, then investments in public education and higher education are merely a luxury to be afforded only if and when we have growth. But if our 21st century definition of growth is correct, that growth comes from inclusion, then investments in public education of every kind are an absolute prerequisite for growth in a modern capitalist economy. The difference in those perspectives is vast. I have to presume that many of you doubt all this. It could not be otherwise. We have been sold the trickle-down tale for all of our lives. We have to remember that these same arguments are as old as civilization. We used to call it divine right. Now we have trickle-down economics. And to be sure, no amount of evidence will ever persuade all of the wealthy and powerful to abandon the self-interest that lies at the center of the trickle-down worldview. That we deserve what we have, and you deserve what you have. That the better we do, the better it will be for you. That we matter, and you don't. But consider this fact, that throughout the history of capitalism, the most democratic nations have also proven to be the most prosperous. And anywhere you find exclusionary, autocratic government, you find poverty. Democracy isn't just correlated with prosperity. It is its cause, because democracy is the most inclusive form of government ever created. And the more inclusive a society is, the more diverse, vibrant, and resourceful its economy. It is this fundamental connection between political inclusion and economic inclusion that I believe our founding fathers understood when proclaiming our inalienable rights. Neoclassical economists, and trickle-down policymakers would have you believe that our current economy is based on economic principles as immutable as physical laws. It is not. Societies are social and moral constructions. Economics is how we encode and enforce our moral and social preferences about status and power. The great thing about democracy is that we have the power to make wise choices about that. We Americans treasure democracy and the freedom it brings, and freedom is core to human happiness. But it's worth considering the possibility that democracy's greatest gift may be inclusion, which is the foundational mechanism of all prosperity. Thank you. Question time?
Yeah. So we have about 20 minutes for questions, and we have microphones situated on either aisle, so I'll ask you just to line up behind there, and we'll alternate back and forth. I'm going to ask you to keep your questions as short as possible so we can get as many in. Let me begin by asking you a quick question. It's something we were talking about on the way over. It's one thing to reconceptualize capitalism and how capitalist economies work. It's another thing to reframe the policy debate and get politicians to start reconceptualizing what public policy implications there are. How do we do that?
Well, you know, I think the core of the enterprise is to confront the neoclassical paradigm and the policy instantiations that flow directly from it. I mean, if you accept the orthodox explanation for growth, then, as I said before, prosperity is inequality is a feature of prosperity, right? And the truth is, and you know, I spend a lot of time in the offices of United States senators and such. no one in Washington, D.C. has contested that idea in a generation. People on both the right and left have accepted these explanations. They actually do believe. President Obama is surrounded by people who believe that if wages for workers go up, that will be bad for the economy. It's absurd and untrue, but yet they believe it. And so you have to create a new theoretical framework, but also you have to derive a bunch of new heuristics and rules of thumb that policymakers can guide their thinking when they make policy. I mean, there is this, I know a lot of people have this idea that the way economic policy is made in our country is you have really smart people in dark rooms looking at really, really complicated algorithms and data and making these scientific judgments about what to do. Nothing could be further from the truth. You know, these are mostly normal people making simplistic decisions based on rules of thumb or things they heard in college or from friends or from think tanks. And if you don't own those rules of thumb and heuristics, then you don't have anything. And so I will give you one example. So, you know, a heuristic, a rule of thumb that you know, is well accepted in our society, and you know that the Speaker of the House of Representatives is running all around the country using whenever the minimum wage comes up is, if you raise the price of employment, guess what happens? You get less of it, right? People believe that. Most people believe that. It just turns out not to be true, right? There's another rule of thumb that you can employ in that circumstance is that when workers have more money, businesses have more customers and need more workers. Now, depending on which of those rules of thumb you accept, you end up in a very, very different policy regime. And the fight, your fight, unless you're as rich as me, but your fight is to get the world to accept that second rule of thumb, right? That's what this is about, is getting broad acceptance in our society that in general, it's not bad for the economy when working people earn more money. And it's not necessarily good for the economy when a few people accumulate massive amounts of wealth. But make no mistake, this is contested territory, right? And if you go to Washington D.C. or if you go to Olympia in Washington State, most people accept the wrong rules of thumb, and that's because look, here's the thing: it's not just because they're evil. I mean, when I look into Speaker Boehner's eyes, by the way, I do not see evil. I see confusion, because Speaker Boehner went to college. Speaker Boehner went to college about the same time I did. He took the same economics course I did from the same well-meaning professor, and that's what we were told. That is a neoclassical theory. If one thing goes up, another thing goes down. Linear, mechanistic, closed system. So if you went to college when he did and when I did, and you took an economics course, that's what they told you. It's just not true, because it's a complex system. It's like an economy. Prosperity is a consequence of a positive circle of life like feedback loop. And when customers have more money, businesses have more customers. This is why high-wage places have low unemployment and low-wage places have high unemployment, right? The minimum wage in Alabama is much lower than it is in Washington State. If the trickle-down guys were right, their unemployment rate would be half of ours. Instead, it's double, right? There are other factors at play, I agree. But it is not true that if wages go up, employment will go down. It's more complicated than that.
Thank you for the very good presentation. And I'm very tempted to agree that we should view capitalism as more of a system of inclusion and innovation. However, when we think about individual actions, there is a little bit of a contradiction in how we view society and how capitalism works. For example, you brought up taxation. Well, society at large benefits from taxation. Individuals would have to give up their personal resources. So if we are to accept the different view of capitalist system, should we also rethink how we view society, that it's no longer composed of individuals, but there is some sort of social common good that we have to reasonably acknowledge? Yeah,
so here's the thing, is that, the thing about economics is that it is how we decide who gets what and why. So if I have everything and you have nothing, one of the reasons that I can enforce that arrangement is with force, right? I can just be like, dude, if you mess with me, I will kill you, all right? And indeed, in many places in the world, that arrangement is enforced in that way, right? But if you have a slightly different political system, like we do, then we have to enforce that arrangement as a structured moral and social agreement. And if you look at the history of how this has evolved, what you always find is rich people saying some form of this: the better I do, the better it will be for you. And so the central argument that we're litigating in our society isn't should we be pro-social or anti-social. The argument we're litigating is whether by being selfish, if I am being pro-social. And the core of the trickle-down argument is that the more money I make, the better it is for you. I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing it for you. The less taxes I pay, the better it will be for you. This is literally what they're saying. Literally what they're saying. The lower taxes are on rich people, not the better it will be for rich people, the better it will be for you. And that is what people in Washington, D.C. and around the world have accepted. This idea that explains where prosperity comes from by making rich people richer. So you don't have to relitigate how people should feel about their society. What you have to relitigate is where prosperity really comes from. And the trickle-down explanation is simply a lie. It's not true. Prosperity comes from you. And the prosperity and the wealth I get is a byproduct of that. And that's what the difference is, I think.
All right. I wanted to ask, if capitalism provides a higher, more beneficial standard of living, why is it taking us so long to remove healthcare from competing companies to a more universal system such as a socialist counterparts, which directly affects lives?
Yeah.
If that's due to, I'm assuming, a poor managerial standpoint, the wrong application of capitalism, would more or less intrusive laws work?
Yeah, so I think I understand your question, which is a super fair question. Is capitalism is so great, then how come nobody has health care in our country? More or less? Yeah, okay, so here's the thing, is that there are 20 prosperous countries in the world, and every single one of them is capitalist, right? Every single one of them. There are no socialist, successful economies on planet Earth. Capitalism, on the other hand, comes in as many flavors as pie. There are all sorts of ways of operating it. And in the same ways, dirt pie tastes terrible, cherry pie tastes yummy. And you know, and a form of capitalist system, the form that we have here in our country, is not the pure form of capitalism or the right form of capitalism, the only form of capitalism. It is just what we have chosen, and mostly what we've chosen as a consequence of letting very rich and powerful people define what we have. But there is no reason why we can't have a different construction which made health care available for all Americans through a single payer program and be any less capitalistic. Healthcare is no different than roads. We build roads here, right? We have a military. That's not socialism. The Air Force is not socialism, right? You could argue that, well, geez, you know, why should I have an Air Force for you? You should have your own Air Force, right? Pick yourself up by your bootstraps. But clearly, you know, healthcare is just another piece of infrastructure that we could deploy, and indeed, if we did, it would offer benefits probably equal to or greater than having an Air Force, and we should do that. So capitalism and the tension here isn't between capitalism and non-capitalism. The tension here is between crony capitalism and real capitalism, in my opinion, and the tension between believing that if you concentrate power and wealth into few hands, that's good for everybody, or if you make the lives better for everybody, that's good for capitalism. And that's what I think is the real issue.
Yes, you mentioned, I believe, that 85% of small businesses fail within the first 18 months.
Yeah.
And then you went on to say how important it is to raise the minimum wage. Those two statements don't seem consistent. Can you speak to that?
Well, I mean, you know, 99% of the reason that most small businesses, well, if you put aside the fact that most people who go into small businesses don't know what they're doing, 99% of the reason that most small businesses fail is they don't have enough customers. right? That's the thing that makes a business go. In the absence of customers, you have no business. And so the surest thing we could do to the economy today to provide more customers to small business is raise the minimum wage. Because here's the thing, if you run a business, if you run a small business, I don't care what kind it is, the percentage of customers you have that are earning the federal minimum wage of $7.25 are zero. Because if you are trying to make a living on $7.25, you are not going out to restaurants to eat. You are not getting haircuts at the salon. You are not sending mom flowers on Mother's Day. You're not. You're sending some money to your landlord. You're giving your grocery money, if you're not on food stamps, to Kroger. And maybe if you're lucky, you're spending a few healthcare dollars. So if you care about small business and creating a pro-small business environment, the shrewdest thing we can do, the most pro-business thing we can do is find a way to make sure that every worker earns more money. And look, let me give you an example. So the orthodox view is that higher wages kill jobs. So as you may know, we passed a $15 minimum wage in Seattle recently. I was very much part of that effort. And we heard from tons and tons of restaurants. We're like, oh, impossible, we can never do it. We'll all go out of business. So here's the thing. Virtually every other, like you go to Alabama or Georgia, the federal tipped minimum is $2.13. In Washington State, it's $9.32. So in Washington State, tipped workers, who make up restaurant workers, right, earn 427% more than they do in Alabama. So if the orthodox view was correct, first of all, Washington State should have slid into the ocean, right? And Georgia and Alabama, they would be like these beacons of amazing economics. And yet, Washington State is currently generating more small business jobs than any state in the nation. Seattle's restaurant business, booming, crazy. You know why? Because when restaurants pay restaurant workers enough so that even they can afford to shop in restaurants, that's not bad for the restaurant business. That's good for the restaurant business, despite what some short-sighted restaurant owners may tell you. Now, here's the thing. I've run 35 different businesses. I'm always asked in the press, well, I've talked to, 99% of restaurant owners say that this will be bad for business. So I have a 14-year-old boy. Maybe some of you will identify. So I can tell you that 99% of 14-year-old boys agree that homework is a useless and costly exercise and an obliteration of their liberties. and that's because 14-year-old boys can instantly calculate the cost of doing homework, but not the benefits, even though the benefits overwhelm the costs. In the same way, any business person can instantly calculate the costs of rising wages, but they can't calculate the benefits of operating in an economy where everybody makes more money. They can't risk adjust for the fact that everybody will have to do the same thing. They can't risk adjust for the fact that now there'll be less price pressure and less margin pressure and so on and so forth. So when you weigh it in your head, even sensible people are like, holy cow, how is this all going to work? And yet it does. If it didn't, Somalia would be awesome because you can buy a ham sandwich there for 10 cents, and Switzerland would suck because they cost 15 bucks. But clearly, that's not true. Clearly, there is a choice to be made between a death spiral economy where wages go lower and products pricing has to go lower, or a virtuous cycle economy of higher and higher wages and higher prices.
I wanted to take exception, if I may, to a couple of your claims. One, your phone is a poor substitute for the library, and it does not include anything like...
Let me guess, a librarian?
Okay. My wife is. And secondly, I thought you helped yourself to this very romantic thing. You said, most apps are solving some problem. I beg to differ. I think most apps are Angry Birds, or there's some game. They're not. And I think it's representative in the following sense. I wonder, as a matter of historical fact, it was not the capitalists who ended child labor. And I think you are saying something like, if they had understood true capitalism, it would be the capitalists who ended child labor. But I just wonder what your answer to that is. And here's another question. I mean, people talk about capitalism and the male now, right? And one problem is the people who need the male most are the ones who are least interesting to companies, right? You're
Yes.
not going to make money off the recluse in the hills who really needs his Social Security. And is it that if I understand true capitalism, I will want to end child labor from those grounds and I'll care about the guy in the hill? Or is it that my capitalist thinking is going to need to be supplemented by some stronger extra moral fiber,
Okay.
which you could read about at the library?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So I'll give you the point about the phone in the library. I'm going to contest your point about Angry Birds because I think that Angry Birds is every bit a solution to a human problem. Look, the point of life, well, I may be alone in this room in thinking that the point of life is fun. Like, the point of life is to have a life which doesn't suck. And
Not at the expense of everyone else.
so says the philosopher. Yeah, absolutely. But Angry Birds is not at the expense of everybody else. And entertainment, art, games should be a core of what we get to devote our time to. And you know, look, chess may be a better game than Angry Birds, but that's a normative discussion that's complex and difficult to sort out. But here's the thing. When I was a kid, you know, if I wanted a toy, my mom had to drive to the store and buy me a physical object, usually at great expense. And today, my 12-year-old daughter can download an app for free, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. But finally, the most important, I think the more substantive question you asked is, and I'll just sort of rephrase it back to you, which is capitalism wants to solve problems where the money is, and often the money isn't where it should be.
Damn straight.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Absolutely true. And part of the problem, again, you know, these are all social constructs, right? We, as a society, get to decide to a certain extent where the money is. Like, we get to decide where the money is. And we get to define what prosperity is. And you know, so there is a difference between policies that benefit a few capitalists narrowly and what benefits capitalism generally. Again, this all comes back to the trickle-down idea that the richer the rich get, the better off everything else will be, and the bigger the big get, the better off everything will be. This is a lie. That's a construction made by the rich and powerful for the rich and the powerful, and as long as you believe it, they're in awesome shape, right? Look, private equity investors like me are taxed at a 15% rate, not the 39% rate that people are taxed who work. Why? Because they persuaded you that what they do is special, and that the richer they got, the better it would be for you. And you nodded. You did. You nodded. You've been nodding for decades. And if you want to change things, you have to stop nodding. You have to stop saying, You have to start saying, no. Prosperity does not trickle down from the top. You are not special. We are. Prosperity is built from the middle out. We should pay the 15% tax rate, and you should pay the 39% tax rate. And that's what the game is.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Nick. So I agree with you that your theory of the middle out is a lot better than the trickle down effect, and I'm completely with you. But with your claim that the middle out economy is better than the trickle down effect, how would you suggest persuading those who have seriously benefited from the trickle down economics to abandon what they've been doing for the last 40 years or so, and try to embrace what you're saying is a better way of doing economy?
Yeah, so to be clear, you don't need the top 1/10 of 1% of earners
to agree. You need 51% of everybody else to agree, right? And the problem is, and it's so interesting because I've been litigating this stuff for a long time. You think that you don't agree, but you do agree with them, right? And the actions you take every day reinforce these old frames. All we need to do is persuade 55% of voting Americans that prosperity is built from the middle out, doesn't trickle down from the top. You don't need to worry about the top 1/10 of 1%, right? And again, the heart of the problem is that most Americans, poor and rich, believe that old story. That Speaker of the House John Boehner could stand in front of a big audience and say, if you raise the price of employment, guess what happens? You get less of it. And people don't chuck tomatoes at him, right? I just want you to think about that phrase. If you raise the price of employment, guess what happens? You get less of it. He is literally saying that if poor people get richer, that will be bad for our country and the economy. That is insane. Put aside the moral point. Like, who will buy the stuff? Who will buy the stuff if people don't have any money anymore? It's insane. It's just ridiculous. But people believe it because they've been told it. And the challenge is to get people to stop believing it. I know I have to go. I just want to one anecdote. So as you know, we did this $15 minimum wage thing, right? And we did it, well, you may not know, but a small group of us decided that we were going to spin up the national minimum wage fight around the country. Started in SeaTac, went to Seattle. It's happening everywhere. You must know. LA just passed $15 for hotel workers. San Francisco's going to do it. Chicago, it's going to go everywhere. But here's the thing. When I first, and the reason we did it is we wanted to find a policy way of instantiating middle out economics. The idea that the more money workers had, the better it would be for business and the more workers we create. I talked to everybody in the minimum wage fight. People have been working on it for decades. And not one of them had ever considered the possibility of raising the minimum wage more than $1. You know why? Because if workers earn more money, then we'll have less employment. I'm not kidding. Like, the people who had devoted their lives to raising the minimum wage in our country had completely and totally accepted that explanation. And the only reason they could offer to increase the minimum wage was because they felt sorry for poor people. Well, that is a crappy way to advance an important policy in a democracy, right? And it took us to be like, if we raise the minimum wage to $15, think about all the extra money that companies would have because of all these customers, and my God, then they'd need more workers, and by the way, then taxpayers wouldn't have to pay for the food stamps that all these low-wage workers are earning. And now all of a sudden you're in a different policy regime, you're talking about stuff that people can really care about. But here's the thing, even the people theoretically on my side have accepted this frame. It's so, so, so deep. I'll tell you one more story. One of my very closest collaborators met with Valerie Jarrett, the president's closest advisor, the day after I think they won, and they're all like, woo, yay. And he's like, well, the middle class is still shrinking, and what's our plan? No plan. And he said, why don't we increase the minimum wage? And she said, we could never do that right now. Our economy is too fragile. Right? Valerie Jarrett's not a bad person. She's a super smart person. An incredible public servant. But she really believes that if we raise wages for workers, that would be bad for the economy. It goes deep, man. And that's the challenge for you. I mean, you may not care. If you care, that's your challenge. So, thank you.
I ask you to join me to thank our speaker. A couple of things. One is Nick is gracious enough to agree to give a second lecture up in Spokane this evening at 7:30 at the Fox Theater. We'll have a reception and a book signing after up there, so you're all welcome to come up there as well. Unfortunately, that means we don't have time to do a reception for him down here because we have to make our way up to Spokane. Just as a token of appreciation, it's hard to know what to get a guy who flies in on his private jet that he might need.
Give me another jet.
but as a small token of our appreciation, we just have this little gift, hopefully to remember this his excellent lecture today. And then also, there's one part of his biography I left out at the beginning, and that is his philosophy degree came from another institution on the other side of the state that we don't talk about. But for today, we wanted to make him an honorary coup. All right, join me now.